Hey everyone, it's Ross Griffin back here again. I'm on my own today. Unfortunately, Elia again is away on some very secret mission. Again, we're going to bring to do that in the future. I guess we better do that soon, otherwise people be getting suspicious if Elia is even alive. I can guarantee she is. But today we've got Alan Muse. Alan is going to talk to us a little bit about the profession, the quantity surveying profession, and how he has seen that profession develop over his career. You're very welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much, Ross, and it's a pleasure to speak to you.
Wonderful. I think, Alan, perhaps you can give an introduction into yourself and your background and your career, and I'll talk a little bit then about maybe the topics that we're going to discuss. But over to you, perhaps there for a few minutes.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Actually, I'm a bit unusual as a chartered surveyor. I've met many chartered quantity surveyors over the years in my role at the RICS, and without most of them actually ended up in the profession having looked at other possibilities in their career. But when I was at school, I actually said to my headmaster, "What do you think that I should do?" When I entered the sixth form, and he said, "Have you thought about quantity surveying?" I've never heard of it. So I actually chose my A-levels in terms of economics, geography and maths to go into quantity surveying. And I've been a quantity surveyor ever since, but I was enthralled by the fact that it combined economics and numeracy and, the outdoors, if you like, as well. And that's why I entered the profession in the first place. So I did a first degree in quantity surveying and then became a chartered surveyor in 1984. I then had a career in private practice and worked overseas extensively as well in the Middle East and East Asia and Indonesia. I thoroughly enjoyed my career, but around about 2011, I was offered to take up a role at the RICS as the quantity survey director there. And I was there until I retired, as you say, last year, and that was also an extremely interesting role and a role I thoroughly enjoyed in terms of developing standards for chartered quantity surveyors around the world. And it gave me a perspective, as you say, Ross, on how quantity surveying has developed over the last 4 or 5 decades, where perhaps it's going, and also the international dimension and how that role that's called many things around the world is actually coming together, I think, in terms of one role. And I think that's an important point as well, because however we got there, we know that the financial management of construction is an extremely important issue, both in terms of how taxpayers' money is spent, but also in terms of how we want to galvanize economies for the future challenges that we all face.
And that's a very important thing. I think we'll get into a little bit more on that. But I think that the topics that we are looking at today really is the changing face of the QS profession, and the subcategories to that. I guess Alan, you're going to discuss a little bit further is the role of the QS and how it has changed over the last 30, 40 years. How ICMS has come into the form over the last 5 to 7 years, and how you see that for the future. And then really looking forward in terms of our methods of measurement, NRM 1 or NRM 2, how we now relate ICMS to NRM, how all of this relating kind of digital projects, and then that feeding into the digital QS, as we have coined it here in Cosmos, that future potential alternative quantity surveying role, the digital QS. And finally, to cap it all off, really we'll discuss the RICS's role in all of this for the future, and again, what they're doing and what you have done, Alan, over the last number of years working with the RICS. But you mentioned a little bit, you've obviously had a wonderful career from experiences from all over the world, working at all sides of the table, I guess I could say. But how has the QS role changed for you over the last number of decades? Can you give a little bit on that?
Yes, I think when I came into the profession, it was still considered to be a technical profession. It was once described to me as the technical accountant to the construction industry, which is certainly one way to look at it. But quantification, when I first worked in the early 80s, quantification was still important in terms of bills of quantities. And that's obviously where the QS role originated from, in terms of the fact that it was more economic to go out to tender with one bill that described the work rather than contractors pricing on several different takes on the design and specification. And I do think we've gone full circle a little bit there in terms of the fact that obviously digitalization, microcomputers were just coming into the industry in the early 1980s as well. So it wasn't as if computers were not thought about in the industry. They were increasingly thought about. But I think what's changed actually is the fact that a lot of the procurement in the industry has changed. It's gone this proliferation of design and build, which has obviously led to less need for quantification. There's been a renewed emphasis, certainly in the last decade, on data and the importance of data and how we standardize that data. And I think that, funnily enough, has gone a bit full circle as well, because I think in the days of the old, certainly in the UK, the old PSA, they spent a lot of time trying to standardize data on construction projects, and then they were virtually disbanded as an organization, and we went back to the private sector, who are sometimes loath to share data. So the sharing of data in industry is a common theme over the years, and how difficult that has become in terms of private sector involvement in the industry. You know, clients want to share data, consultants want to share data if their clients do, but contractors, funnily enough, probably are a little bit more risk averse at sharing data because it's their competitive advantage at the end of the day. And one thing that's changed in the industry, I think, is the gap between what the price is for the work as advertised by the contractor and what the price is in terms of cost plans and benchmarking. Because bills of quantities used to really delve into that data and give you that data firsthand in the past. But now, of course, it's always secondhand, or it always tends to be based on analysis, which is why that data standardization and data analysis and sifted is so important to the industry. I think there have basically been. I think the changes revolve around four main areas in my experience. One is obviously digitalization, and we've moved on a lot there in terms of technology and the potential for technology. But I still think quantity surveyors are missing a trick really in the use of 5D BIM, and that leads on to another area that's changed, which is the one of collaboration. I think the industry is, in a good way, less adversarial than it used to be. But that collaboration needs to be embraced a bit more, I think, by quantity surveyors to actually gain information from BIM models that is useful to them as well as useful to the design team, because a lot of the debate on BIM models has been design-centric, and it needs to be wider. It needs to include cost and carbon in a more seamless way than it does at the moment. I think there's a lot of work going on in that area at the moment by lots of people, but I think that needs to come to fruition for the QS role to actually then concentrate more on a business consultancy angle rather than necessarily quantification and data. Because what the quantification and data will give you is an ability to look at multi-scenario option planning in a much more rigorous way, to BIM it before you build it, as the term goes. And I think that quantity surveyors can offer a lot of really good advice to clients in terms of cost and carbon if they can seamlessly interact with a BIM model almost in real time, which I think is coming, but I think we still need to do some work on. I think the whole issue of digitalization and how that allows the QS to go into also carbon counting and decarbonisation is the big issue. And that's the other theme that I think has come through strongly in the last 10 years, decarbonisation, sustainability and the ESG agenda. And I think in terms of the numeracy of the QS profession and the fact that we're at the centre of the data on most construction projects, it's a unique opportunity for the QS profession to grasp that opportunity and be completely involved in carbon counting as far as the client's concerned. I think another area that needs to be looked at by QSs is this trend that I just mentioned towards a more business consultancy role. I think quantity surveyors over the years have got involved more at the beginning of projects, more at the project inception and project initiation. I think in terms of selling their advice, if you like, they need to do that more and develop really rigorous procedures for ensuring that the data is validated, that they could give interactive advice on cost and carbon, and they can actually affect the design and project right from the early stage, or programs of work even. And I think the final thing I've mentioned is going back to the international debate. As I mentioned before, I think, when you look around the world at the financial management of construction, if I can call it that, you've got quantity surveying in the UK and ex-British influence areas around the world. You've got cost engineering in America. You've got other terms for the similar role elsewhere in the world. I think what we need to do is try and bring those very similar skill sets together to harmonise the profession and provide unified standards for the profession, which is where, of course, international cost management standard comes into play as well.
Just going back to your point then on the 80s, and we've come full circle here, are we, in your opinion, in a better position now in terms of data analytics, in terms of standardization, and coming back to the old day bill of quantities again? Are we in a better position now than we would be in the 80s for success? What's your opinion on that?
I think so, because technology's moved on so much. I think the potential of technology in terms of databases and cloud and automation, AI, all those advances in technology means that actually, if we do have standard systems for the collection of data, and we do get the data, then we can manipulate it and analyze it and verify it to a much greater degree than we could before. I can remember a small anecdote. When I first started to work, the senior partner in the practice I first worked for had just got a microcomputer on his desk. This is 1981, and he didn't really know what to do with it. And as a graduate, he said, "Can you write a program for this?" So I wrote a program for it, for a cash flow forecast for a project based using beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction coding, which was basic, as it was termed then. And he could then use it, and he was happy because he could actually use his microcomputer for doing something related to quantity surveying. I mean, if you looked around the office then, you'd also have reams and reams of data in terms of bills of quantities of old projects, bills of quantities that were being produced at the time, which just weren't utilized and used in any usable form. So I think the big difference now is we have the technology. But I think allied to that is we need to remember as quantity surveyors that when we develop the quantity surveying profession, we are part of a team. We do need to develop it in accordance with the other team members, particularly architects, engineers, services engineers, structural engineers, etc. And therefore, we need to work with them in terms of development of digitalization across the piece. But they, in turn, need to understand our role and what we need in terms of the right information in the right form at the right time. So it's complicated construction, as we know, as a process. What we need to do as a profession is basically ensure we've got standardized systems for collection of that data, and then integrate in an interdisciplinary way with other professions, so that when systems are set up on projects, it provides us with the information we need at the right time, as well as the design team members. Because actually, clients, if the quantity surveyor has that early conversation with clients about that type of issue, then I think most clients can see the benefits. And if it costs more to actually produce a BIM model in that way, then if the clients can see the benefits of that information being produced in that way and readily available, then I'm sure they'll buy it.
But I don't think it costs more to produce the BIM models more. In the initial stage, because a lot of the industry is only beginning now to a certain degree, there is an additional expense, but there's a value creation and costs reduce. It's like any new product, right, that comes on the market. It's expensive initially. Look at the flat screen TV way back 2 decades ago, the price of them. Look at them now. You get 3 times the size of the TV for half the price. It's the same with BIM. It's the same with any new approach to anything. Initially, it's a bit of investment, but the return on that investment over 5-10 years is immeasurable, I would say, to clients, but also to architects, engineers, and more importantly, I would say, to quantity surveying practices, where right now, if you look at the industry, you can't get a quantity surveyor. they're impossible to get. They're like hen's teeth or gold dust. And digitization and information and standardization will be the key of unlocking that kind of powerful delivery for QSs with the same number of people, same number of staff, I would say. So very interesting. But actually, that kind of leads us in quite smoothly into the QS's role you discussed, but that standardization and that data collection now. So can you talk a little bit about ICMS? You mentioned it earlier, International Construction Measurement Standards.
Yeah, certainly. The RICS, as you know, have had a long history of being involved in the development of standards for surveying generally and quantity surveying in particular. And in 1922, they produced the Standard Method of Measurement 1, which was a way of standardizing quantification in the building industry. And of course, that's been updated several times, culminating in SMM 7, and then thereafter in 2011, NRM 1, 2, and 3, which now form the basis in the UK for a total cost management service from cost planning right through to life cycle costing. So that also made us think in terms of the international agenda about the fact that the profession had not developed an international standard for quantity surveying. International standards have been developed in other areas, in accountancy for balance sheet reporting, in other areas in the RICS, such as valuation and the Red Book, the International Valuation Standards. So it seemed to be quite logical to produce an international standard for quantity surveying. The question was, how could that add value to the marketplace, and how should it be done? And how it was done, which is the last point, is quite important, which I'll come back to. But certainly in terms of what it should be, we felt that, first of all, it had to be high level, because maybe eventually we will have a common standard of method around the world. That was quite a big task, certainly initially, and possibly would have been very difficult to agree and invoke. So what we agreed was that we needed some kind of overarching, not method of measurement so much, but reporting system for cost, that we could say to clients on an international basis, both in the public and private sectors, both in buildings and civil engineering. And that was important because we thought that we should combine those two worlds, because quite often in cost management senses, they are divided and artificially divided in terms of the fact that we had the NRM and the Institute of Civil Engineers had the civil engineering standard method of measurement, and never the twain shall meet, as it were. So we felt that ICMS should be high level and overriding and can combine buildings and civil engineering. It obviously needed to be a consensually agreed document amongst all the different professional institutions involved in quantity surveying and design around the world. So how we did this, this brings me on to how we did it. What we did was we formed a coalition of 50 professional organizations from around the world, including all the main quantity surveying institutions in Canada, Australia, Africa, wherever, plus some of the key architectural and engineering institutions. And they came together and signed basically an understanding that they would set up a technical committee to develop this standard, and that, if you like, they would keep the politics out of the technical committee by agreeing to do this work, by allowing the intellectual property for the work to reside amongst the coalition members. So that work was started in 2016, and ICMS 1 was produced, which initially just dealt with capital costs. And then ICMS 2 was produced a couple of years later, which dealt with capital costs and life cycle costs, again in an overarching reporting sense way. And then thirdly, our current edition, ICMS 3, deals with capital costs, life cycle costs, and carbon. And it can be used for each of those in isolation. In many parts of the world, life cycle costs perhaps haven't taken off in the way that they have in some economies. So it's deliberately produced so that you can pick and choose how you want to use ICMS. But the important thing is that it's a standardized classification for cost reporting, which can then drill down into national standards and can be linked to whatever national standards are applicable in your own marketplace. Now, some markets have developed national standards like we have in the UK with NRM, as I've just discussed, like Germany has, like Canada and Australia have. But some markets have no standards at all. So in certain African economies, you can use ICMS as a base starting point for codification of costs because they have no national standards in use at all. So it can be used in a flexible way around the world. And obviously, our aim is to collect data based upon that reporting system, which might not be detailed data, but it's certainly enough data to benchmark construction costs on a worldwide basis and thereby be able to compare costs on a worldwide basis because many clients actually want to do that. And there's no system in place for doing it. So that allows something that wasn't possible before in construction. I think the second point about ICMS, which is sometimes overlooked, is back to the point I made earlier, which is it's beginning to unify the financial management of construction on a worldwide basis between the different nomenclatures that exist around the world for quantity surveying. So cost engineers in America are interested in ICMS, quantity surveyors are interested in ICMS, and virtually professionals, in my experience, from around the world, if they're technical architect and they don't have a quantity surveyor in their economy, they're interested in ICMS. So it begins to unify the skill of the financial management of construction as well. And I think that's an important.
And I think it's very timely also, actually, because the way our industry now is moving towards digitization and the implementation of BIM, this global standard for cost managers, quantity surveyors, now offers us the opportunity actually to take something and standardize our costs across our multi-jurisdictional office base and client base, etc. Up until now, that wasn't available. So global cost information and cost data, the reason we don't have it is that, well, it's all collected in different structures, if it is collected at all. So extremely timely, the introduction of ICMS. And just to clarify again for our listeners, ICMS is not a measurement rule like NRM or ARM. It's an overarching cost structure. You still need your measurement rules underneath ICMS, regardless of where you are positioned and are located in the world. So yeah, it's something very important to remember, because I often hear a lot of people talking about ICMS replacing NRM or replacing ARM in Ireland, if you like, and I always repeat that no, it's not. It's supplementary. It sits over, or it might replace the national building standards for cost structure, for example, in the future. But it is only a cost structure, not a measurement rule.
That's a good point, Ross. A very important point. So another important point about ICMS, which I'd like to mention, is that a lot of people just consider it to be, a cost taxonomy, a cost breakdown structure, but actually, it's the values and attributes in ICMS that are very important to align to that data, because the technical committee which I chaired was very keen to ensure that certainly at a high level, that every entity that you looked at, whether it was a dam or a road or a building, had a set of key criteria attached to it which described the cost drivers for that particular project or series of projects that you're working on. And when people are collecting data, it's very important that they do collect the values and attributes as well as the costs, because it's not just about the costs. It's about, obviously, as any quantity surveyor knows, it's the cost drivers that are associated with those particular costs that are important.
And that's a very good point. I'm delighted that you brought that up, actually, because ICMS again is not just a cost structure. It's actually I guess a guide for data collection when it comes to commercial information around your construction project. So we spoke in some of our other podcasts about that information being super important, like the quality levels, the location, the types, has it basement construction, is there difficulties with water, the geotechnical information relating, all of that is hugely valuable when understanding the basis of that cost information. So ICMS it is not just a cost breakdown structure, it is much, much more. And I would for sure advise anybody to have a look at the website, the ICMS website, and download it. It's free to download. But that kind of brings us in nicely into NRM, then the national rules, new rules of measurement, both 1 and 2. And we want to talk a little bit about the relationship then with rules of measurement and ICMS, and perhaps this changing landscape of digitization, etc. For me, I think the rules of measurement, if I consider NRM2 or if I consider ARM in Ireland, I think they're probably outdated and need a revision. I think when we talk about digital projects, BIM and now ICMS, what's your opinion on that, Alan, or have you any experience in that type of discussion?
I think, again, it's a very good point, Ross, and I think I think we're in a bit of a sticking plaster situation at the moment with NRM. First of all, just going back, retracing our steps, as I said, NRM 1 and 3, which deal with cost planning and lifecycle costing, respectively, are part of the management system that's developed around quantity surveying in terms of cost planning through to lifecycle costing. And they were only developed by the RICS to augment the quantification element, which is NRM 2, about 10, 12 years ago. So the issue is now that was a good idea, I think, to try and quantify and standardize those elements of cost management. But we're still left with this dichotomy between how you quantify for cost planning versus how you quantify for tender. Now, what's happened in the UK in particular, to use that market, is that NRM2, we find, is very, very rarely used by the QS profession because people don't do bills of quantities anymore. Or because of the proliferation of design and build, generally speaking, projects are not quantified in the way that they used to be quantified 30 or 40 years ago, talking about differences in quantity surveying. So what people tend to do is use NRM 1 and 3, but not 2. This is in a quantity surveying consultancy sense. However, what we found, the people who use NRM2 are actually the trade subcontractors who still want to quantify the work for their bids to the main contractors in the same way, because they're used to those measurement rules. And those measurement rules are trade by trade as opposed to being elemental or by cost buckets. So you've got actually two different systems there. You've got a cost management system, which is elemental, and you've got a trade-by-trade quantification system. And to put them, and they've never actually, those two systems have never actually worked well together, and you can't actually analyze costs between them in a very good way either. So that's one issue. So the second point is the whole digitalization debate, I think, and particularly the fact that as we develop bid models to quantify work, and as we want to put cost databases against that quantification, i.e. 5D BIM, then we need methods of measurement that look at level of information, level of detail more. Because, for example, you might have, say, RIBA, to use that plan of work in the UK, RIBA stage 2, you might have quite detailed information, design information about particular elements, but very, very scant information about others, particularly, for example, mechanical electrical services. So your level of information and level of detail are actually driving the cost certainty that you're providing in advice to the client. And that needs to be reflected much more, I think, in terms of the cost advice that's given. And it needs to integrate with the BIM model. So where I'm coming from there is that there needs to be a total cost management system across the whole life cycle, from cost inception to life cycle costing. And that needs to not be on a trade-by-trade basis. I think what the RICS might do, and this is only hypothesis, but what they might do is separate out the trade-by-trade quantification and say, well, if subcontractors want that, it's a supplement. But actually, the cost management system is like this, like NRM 1 and 3, but actually aligning it much more to the digital process and the BIM model. And we might call it digital NRM or something. So I think that's the next logical progression for the standards that the RICS would produce for quantity surveying. And I think one thing that I think has happened in the last perhaps 5 years is that people are now looking at 5D BIM and 6D and 7D, but people are looking at 5D BIM in terms of how quantity surveyors input into this process in a very serious way. And I'm I'm actually working with somebody looking at that at the moment. So I think it's something that's going to become much more mainstream. I think we've had a few false storms in that regard, but I think now it's coming through in a bigger way, and clients are looking at it seriously, because clients want the seamless data, particularly if they're involved in the operation of buildings. They want seamless data from inception right through to operation.
There's a value there for it, that data that was collected and generated during design and construction could effectively be monetized and sold with the building in the next stage or in the future, etc. So there's a whole load of opportunities here. But I think it's very refreshing to hear you talk about NRM and the potential change, because that connectivity to the digital workflow of the design team and the 3D models, if we can formulate our methods of measurement around that and automate more, it means that the QS and cost manager can concentrate on real value creation, not necessarily quantification. We become more quality managers and I guess valuers, rather than just quantity surveyors. And I think that's really where the change is coming. A lot of it for us really is value creation. Is there value in spending your time quantifying in this way? If the answer is no, then why are we doing it? And we really discuss that a lot. And that leads in very nicely into then the digital QS and the future for the quantity surveyors. In a hypothetical future where ICMS is now a global standard used by everybody, we have national measurement standards that integrate seamlessly in with the design process and that entire evolution. Then we have this new formalization, which is this role of the digital QS that suddenly isn't what you were doing 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It is now a different approach completely to project lifecycle delivery and how we, as you mentioned earlier on, engage and interact and communicate and collaborate with the other stakeholder groups like the architects, the engineers, the BIM coordinators as well. There's a whole new landscape here. What does that look like for you, in your opinion, Alan?
Well, I think this is something else that the RICS, when I was there, was looking at, and I think we need to look at it perhaps a bit more urgently, and that is the training and implicitly the education requirements for quantity surveyors. I think there can be some kind of central data expert in construction. I think they can bring in carbon and sustainability considerations, but and understand the full potential, as you say, in value creation for clients in construction. But I think that requires some adjustments to training and qualification. And one of the problems sometimes in any profession is that education and training tends to be looking out the rear window, because it's about how you protect the profession going forward, and it's about how you continue with the skills that you've always had. I think anybody who's read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, knows that actually sometimes things just, he coined the phrase paradigm shift, and sometimes things just alter very quickly. And I think if we're not careful in quantity surveying, things could alter very quickly. We could be left behind a little bit. I actually think that, the history of technology is that it doesn't usurp traditional roles, that those roles just find other things to do. And I think that's the opportunity for quantity surveyors, as you've already alluded to, Ross, here. But I do think that the profession itself, in the form of the professional institutions, need to urgently look at education qualifications. And I think that the universities are already doing so to a degree. So it's a continuation of their efforts in these areas. But I do think we've always got this dynamic tension between, if you like, academia, the professional institutions, and industry. And actually, the ultimate answer to this is that industry needs, graduates that can work with them in terms of delivering what clients need. And we mustn't become too abstruse or detached from what industry needs either. So there needs to be a lot more collaboration between industry, academia, and professional institutions. And ultimately, what that means is that I think people from industry, if they can embrace and give some time to their institution and get involved in bringing their new thinking into the professional institutions, that's a very good thing for the future. And ultimately, that's how that problem is going to be solved. Because I think in the past, sometimes when governments have stimulated thought in this area, such as the Level 2 BIM mandate in the UK in 2016, people felt, some of the profession felt that this wasn't relevant to them. And this is the continual problem sat where I was sat at the professional interface, because half the profession don't know what the other half of the profession are doing. And this wave might come and just subsume them overnight. I do think that there's something else about this. It's what we used to call the profession technology interface. Now, technology can be very disruptive, and in many areas looks like it could be disruptive. In some ways, it's being disruptive, but perhaps fails. Dare I mention purple bricks or somebody? But I mean, so technology is not always successful. Where it's most successful, the professions and technologies work together. So we need to work together with the people who are trying to put software into place for quantity surveying and data collection in terms of our professional workflows. And that was another aim of ICMS and in fact, NRM. It's an attempt to try to put our needs as a profession into something that's, from a technology point of view, able to be replicated in software. But that means that the software vendors need to understand our professional workflows, and we need to understand their market and what they're trying to do as well. So there's a number of engaged stakeholders here in terms of developing the profession moving forward. It's quite a complicated picture, but ultimately what it comes down to is industry in terms of what they're reacting to and their clients want, working with others, giving some of their time to others, as well as working on their they're all busy people working in their consultancies and the professions, but they need to give some time back to try and alter the course of the profession and alter how education and training takes place. Otherwise, I'm afraid we might just start, what's been done in the past is very difficult to change, and there's a certain stasis that's difficult to alter in terms of professional institutions. I know, I've been there.
Like 2 points that are very interesting there. If you actually look at the curriculum at the moment across universities for quantity surveyors, when I read it, I look at it and go, this is very similar or almost identical to what I was taught 20 years ago. What has changed in the last 20 years in terms of how we're educating our QSs? Very, very little, actually. And right now, as a company, Cosmos, for example, we're looking for QS professions, and we write up, our requirements for anybody looking for a job: digitization, data analytics, potential skill sets in coding, and all of these aspects are not being taught at all to our QSs coming out of graduation. So we have there's a big shift coming here for sure. And as you mentioned, the collaboration between industry and education and academia is very, very important here. The other point is, I would say that if we don't do something, the software companies will write us out of the future, because they'll just write code for something. It doesn't really matter as long as it has an output, and they don't really have to focus on our process. They can just eradicate us to a certain degree from the process. And that is currently where we are right now at the moment, I would say, and how we see the digital QS of the future being so important, but at this very pivotal moment. So very, very interesting. The final point, so Alan, before we close, the RICS's role in all of this. How do you see that? We talked about academia, we talk about NRM, ICMS, the changing role of the QS, but what does the RICS need to do here?
Yeah, the RICS is probably the largest professional institution representing quantity surveyors in the world. That's why although we weren't the whole of the coalition, we did initiate ICMS, and we did talk to the other people about coming together. And so it's really important, I think, that, coming back to my point about industry and practitioner participation in the RICS, that quantity surveyors have their say, and they do have their say. I think because the RICS is a land property and construction body, quite a wide professional body, sometimes particular tribes within the RICS feel that their voice is not heard, but I can assure them that it could be heard if they get involved. And I would encourage all RICS members to, and I know a lot of them are very keen to do so, and a lot of them do get involved, but the power of the RICS is definitely in the voice of their membership, and particularly in quantity surveying, I think, which is still seen as a little bit of a sort of more technical profession compared with general surveying, if you like, that they do, voice their concerns about the way the profession is going and affect education and training, affect the APC process, affect the things that RICS is quite a large body with good governmental connections and good connections on the international scene can actually affect for the QS profession. And the most important thing, I think, is from my years at the RICS was bringing people together, whether it's on the international stage or whether it's the architects and engineers and other people involved in construction in the UK. The RICS has got a brand and it can bring people together to solve some of these problems. And we know there's big challenges for the quantity surveyors of the future, but the flip side of that coin is there's massive opportunities as well. And it's important that the professional institution, and they have done this, they've done a lot of thought leadership and exploration of these areas. But I do feel that there's sometimes a bit of disconnect between the thought leadership and action. And I think the action comes from the members voicing their concerns. And, you can voice your concerns about general matters such as sustainability or diversity and inclusion, and that's all very important. But I think also the members need to voice their concerns about the technical professional issues, because that's not just somebody else's problem. That's the RICS's problem as well.
Exactly. It's super interesting and exciting, I think, being in this profession at this moment in time. I do believe that it's a paradigm shift we're going through, and what comes out the other side is, well, it only remains to be seen, really. But Alan, thank you very much for your time today. It was great to speak to you, and I hope that I speak to you again soon in the future.
My pleasure, Ross. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.